This is the reading of Chapter 9 of Lester Sumrall's book, My Story to His Glory. Please subscribe to the channel. Help me get to 1,000 subscribers to get monetized. Also, if you'd like to send a gift, those are the two options that you have. Chapter 9, where East meets West. From Java, we sailed to the flat, swampy island of Singapore and into the port city of Singapore itself, considered to be one of the world's busiest ports and major commercial and shipping center of Southeast Asia. It is a small island comprising only 224 square miles, connected to the southern tip of Malay Peninsula by a stone and cement causeway, or a bridge, that carried railway tracks, a highway, and a pipeline across the Johor Strait. Hundreds of junks and sampans, canvas-covered floating shops and homes with colorful rag-patched sails crowded the harbor, along with large ships being loaded or unloaded. It was a bustling place even in 1935. We had been told that every race, color, and blood mixture dwelt together in Singapore, the place where East meets West. That wasn't hard to believe as we looked at a blend of people. About 3 out of 4 Singaporeans we learned were Chinese, and about 15 out of every 100 people were Malays. Most of the other people in the city and the country were Indians, Pakistanis, and Europeans. We found ourselves preaching mostly to the Chinese in a large, crowded church. While we were only there for 2 nights of meetings, we saw many souls saved and needs met. We sailed next through the South China Sea to the Crown Colony of Hong Kong, a beautiful island city whose name itself means fragrant harbor. Our entrance into this large harbor preceded by only 6 years the bombing of the city of Japan, on the same day that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. It didn't take us long to understand the truth of the term noisy China. About 98% of Hong Kong's people are Chinese. Men on the street selling their wares uttered loud, weird shrieks. People near the flat where we stayed played the radio or phonograph by their open windows, all in Chinese. In addition, there was the clatter of people walking, their shoes resounding on the cement pavement. There were people everywhere. Then we were confronted with the strange smells of the Orient. It would take some getting used to for this boy from the wide-open country down south. Incense sticks burned outside doors to the gods of the door for protection. In the old city, there was the sweetish smell of burning opium seeping from the dark opium dens. It seemed strange to see the women carrying heavy burdens while the men ambled ahead of them unconcernedly. Whenever we encountered this disregard for the status of women, something rose up on the inside of me in protest. The open, untidy shops wedged together along narrow streets intrigued me, but the food looked unappetizing. Ragged rickshaw runners bellowed for a clear path along the crowded streets. Yet there was another side to Hong Kong in the beautiful downtown section where many of the English and Europeans lived. Here there were wide streets and modern architecture and beautiful shops. During the 10 days we were in Hong Kong, we were busy with 3 services a day, but we had the joy of knowing that souls were being saved daily and others were being filled with the Holy Spirit and with power for living. And there were many healings also. The ancient religions of China have imposed dark superstitions among the spiritually darkened people. The Chinese adhere to ethics of Confucius, worship Buddhist deities, and subscribe to the Taoist demonology. Strangely, their birth, marriage, and funeral functions often embrace the teachings of all 3. This was grievous to us who realized that they were demon-inspired. We saw a heathen priest burning counterfeit paper money in the streets before a funeral procession, claiming that this was helping the dead pay his way through the spirit world. They place food before a corpse in a coffin for the dead to eat, and the rats devour it at night. Then the priest explained that the spirit of the dead took the food. We learned of the people who were afraid of certain trees because an evil spirit supposedly lived there. We observed them kneeling before idols, one of which held the sun in its hand, another the moon, and another a great drawn sword. Yet another possessed about 50 hands extending from all parts of the body. To these they give honor and glory. I thought about the many Old Testament passages that issue God's warning against such practices. Brother Carter wanted to continue through China to the borders of Tibet and Burma to visit the missionary graduates of his London Bible School. When it was about time to depart Hong Kong for Yunnan Phu, I didn't know what to do. My funds until now had been adequate, thanks to the provision of God's people as we traveled along, but now I found myself with insufficient money. I took my passage on the boat to Hanoi, and then the train for 3 days to the inner city. We had agreed to travel by faith and not discuss our personal finances. I committed the matter to prayer, not saying anything to Mr. Carter. Right at this time, a Chinese woman who had come from the mainland to Hong Kong for an expensive operation was miraculously healed by God at one of our meetings. When her healing was confirmed by the doctor, she immediately sought me out and placed into my hand the money she had brought with her for medical expenses. Not only that, but she also brought 3 crates of food that she said we would need for the journey. Later, we were especially to praise God for that food, for our survival in the hinterland would have been most difficult without it. Thanks to that lady, all my expenses for our entire 90 days to Tibet and back were met, with some to spare. After a thrilling baptismal service for the new converts, Howard Carter and I set sail once more. This time it was to be a stormy trip across the Gulf of Tonkin in a small combination steamer. We docked in the muddy bay of Haiphong, French Indonesia, or Indochina, or Vietnam. The next morning, we boarded a little mountain train for a 3-day journey into Yunnan province, the most backward section of China. We carried our own food, as did the natives. We had been told that the train would not be traveling at night, as the mountains were very high and it was a treacherous trip even in the daylight. So we shared primitive hotels 2 nights with the resident rats and the roaches on our way through the backside of the world. After crossing the border into the mainland China at Laoke, the route became one of the most remarkable feats of engineering in the world. For the first time in my life, I became travel sick as the little French train swung us through what seemed like endless tunnels that pierced the towering peaks of China's mountains. The curves were actually so sharp that you could look out the window and see the rear coaches entering into the tunnel you had just come out of. Soot and cinders were thrown back into the open windows. It was a hot and uncomfortable trip, to say the least. One afternoon of the 3rd day, our train finally pulled into the ancient walled and guarded capital city of Yanfu, now called Kunming, in southwest China. From the station, we rode by rickshaw through the rough, uneven cobblestone streets crowded with strange sights and smells. As we passed through the huge gates of this old city, I looked up and saw guards standing overhead, guns in hand. There was much to see and observe. We gazed in wonder at the hieroglyphics and the carvings in the magnificent architecture of the city. Once again, we noticed the people. Always my eyes were studying their faces, and always they looked familiar. These precious souls I had seen in my vision. I noticed for the first time the hobbling Chinese woman whose feet had been bound because of a 1,500-year-old custom that originated when a petty ruler sought as his bride the girl with the smallest feet. My heart ached for these people, so bound by superstition, who needed desperately to have more than their feet unloosed, but whose minds and hearts had been held captive for generations by false teachings. In this land of few waterworks and fewer sewage systems, the stench was even worse than in Hong Kong. Streets were jammed with people as well as animals. Donkeys and mules were everywhere. Merchants pushed their wares in wheelbarrows. Others carried eggs and persimmons and other produce in huge woven baskets suspended from shoulder poles. Little girls played a game on the ground that looked like hopscotch, and often the baby of the family would be securely strapped to their backs. What an education I was getting. I didn't have much time to think about the folks back home, but when I did, I said to myself that no one would believe that rowdy Lester Sumrall was seeing what he was seeing and doing what he was doing. We stayed at the mission house where Howard Carter had made arrangements. For 2 weeks we ministered in that area of Yunnan to the lepers, the opium addicts, and those in the mission stations up and down the railroad route. We saw the heathen worshiping thousands of ugly gods. We visited the slave girls' market located in the local jail. There were 24 pitiful girls for sale. We went to a German Christian orphanage where girls redeemed or were bought by the missionaries were being taught from the Bible and shown the love of God. They had clean clothes, clean beds to sleep in, toothbrushes and personal items, and they were learning needlework and other handcrafts. In the evenings, the missionary would blow his trumpet in front of the large mission hall in the mission compound where we were staying, and in 5 or 10 minutes it would be filled with Chinese. Interestingly, a wooden partition built down the center of the mission hall separated the men from the women while worshiping. This was a very difficult mission field for these missionaries, and our hearts felt heavy for them. We knew we had to transfer this burden to the Lord, even as the missionaries assured us that they did. And I learned the meaning of casting one's burden on the Lord and leaving it there. See Matthew 11:28. In those pre-World War II days in China. Then it was time to move on once again. The next lap of our journey was to be an 18-day trip to other mission stations farther inland. The British and the American consuls both advised against this journey, as the route was infested with robber bands and communists who were looking for those they could capture for ransom. We were reminded that American missionaries John and Betty Stam had fallen into the hands of Red forces that captured the city of Tsing, I don't know how to say it, on December 6, 1934. And that ransom demand for their release had been set at $20,000. It had been widely circulated that an army of 2,000 communists had increased to 6,000 as it swooped down on the district, leaving many dead behind and carrying others away as captives. The terror reigned supreme. All who could had fled, and there was much looting. The Stams had been taken captive and forced on a treacherous 20-mile journey, and shortly thereafter they were painfully bound with ropes, their hands behind them. Then they were stripped of their outer garments and forced to walk through the streets of Miyashio like their master. They were led up a little hill outside the town, and there, in a clump of pine trees, they were forced to kneel. There was a quick command, the flash of a sword, and John and Betty Stem were ushered into the presence of the Lord. Just prior to this, Betty Stem had hidden their infant daughter, and she was rescued 30 hours later. We heard all of this, and we knew these raving red marauders were merciless. We had also been advised that this was the wet season, and it was better not to travel unless it was absolutely necessary. Not only roads, but entire villages had been known to be washed away by torrential rains. So we prayed and sought the Lord's leading. In the end, Carter felt it was God's will that we should go on, and I was on the same mind. A Christian brother fitted us out with the kind of clothes that we needed. He supplied us with zipperless, knee-length trousers, which seemed baggy enough for me to wrap around myself 3 times. These were tied with a rope around our waist and tucked into knee-high boots. Over this, we wore loose shirts and coats with buttons made of knots of the same cloth. These were the traditional clothes of the hinterland China. Along with these outfits, we were given oilskin capes. We hired a cook and an interpreter and rented 17 pack animals, including horses, for us to ride. The mules carried huge packs on each of their sides and wore V-shaped wooden saddles with our cots and beds piled on top of that. Sometimes we sat astride the bedding high above the wild country trails that was often only 6 feet wide. Finally, it was time to bid adieu to the last ramparts of civilization for what would turn out to be 9 very long weeks. The British consulate sent a guard of soldiers along with us for protection. Our destination, the borders of Tibet and Burma.